Welcome to Hope and a Dose. Today we dive into one of the most dynamic areas in medicine, cell and gene therapies. These innovative treatments include autologous and allogeneic cell therapies, and they promise transformative outcomes but come with unique challenges. Today we'll explore why autologous therapies, despite their curative potentials, are complex to deliver, and how allogeneic approaches aim to simplify access. Joining me are Andrea Serres, Senior Director of Strategic Delivery and Growth Oncology and Gene Therapy here at Fortrea, and Martin Collins, Fortrea's Director of Global Site Identification, who share their insights on site and country selection strategies, the expansion of CAR-T beyond oncology into autoimmune diseases, and how building strong site networks and fostering collaboration can accelerate trial success. From early phase considerations to scaling globally, this conversation uncovers what it takes to bring cutting-edge therapies to patients worldwide. Let's get started. Hi, Andrea. Hi, Martin. So my first question so what are the trends that you are seeing in cell and gene therapy trials?
Thank you, Luis, for calling us here to discuss the therapy types using cell therapies and gene therapies. It is one of the most dynamically changing environment in the therapy types, and the different type of therapies are autologous and allogenic cell therapies. And the past years of clinical research has demonstrated the curative results of the autologous cell therapies. Both clinicians and patients are very excited to enter and receive autologous cell therapies because of the high probability that their disease will be cured forever. However, providing autologous therapies is extremely difficult. There are different levels of difficulties connecting different departments. For example, in case of non-oncological cell therapies, providing the manufacturing in a consistent and a steady way, as well as reaching to the patients, which are scattered on large geographic areas. So the imminent need to introduce allogenic products which can be delivered to the patients directly rather than centralizing the patients in CAR-T centers is one of the area which is very largely researched and invested by biotech and also pharma companies. And we worked very closely with Martin on finding the right strategy to identify the sites who can provide the treatments both in autologous and allogenic setup. What is your experience, Martin, in these country strategies following the 1-year research what you have invested in this area?
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I think from my side, what's really interesting is seeing the expansion of some of these traditional therapies into non-oncology areas. So we're seeing, particularly CAR-T, both allogeneic and autologous, expanding into areas that are more to do with autoimmune than traditional hematology. And quite often we're seeing a single cell line expanding into multiple indications. So, for example, the mode of action of B-cell depletion, for example, could equally be applicable to rheumatoid arthritis or SLE or lupus nephritis. And that makes it interesting to select sites because often we're working across departments to find out whether the sites have got the capacity and the ability to take these trials on. I think what really interests me, though, is how we approach our country selection strategy. Because there's a bit of a trade-off there for me between the countries that have got a long established experience of cell therapy and the fact that a lot of those sites are starting to show congestion. They've got a lot of trials, they're delivering cell therapies as a healthcare solution. And so we're having to take a step back and think, well, these are the countries with the longest history, the best capability, but they're starting to get to capacity. So what strategies do we define next? And I know, Andrea, one of your key pieces of work is putting country strategies together for this. So how would you approach that? How would you go looking across countries for a strategy for a new cell therapies trial?
A very good question, Martin. It very much depends on the stage of the clinical trial, what we are looking into, what we can see that very often the ideal strategy for the client, for our client, is to initiate the first trials very close to the manufacturing site in order to properly manage the vein-to-vein process or the manufacturing process to reach to the patients in due time. So I would say that in case of early phase clinical trials, this is one of the main considerations what our clients are looking for. However, when we are going further and we are looking into expansion arms, these are the moments when the client has to implement already a more robust manufacturing process, and they have to be able to supply sites which are at a longer distance, potentially in other countries as well. And here comes the question, in which countries should we go secondly, thirdly, and so on. And the question again is, should we go to the countries which have already experience, but as you said, they are congestion, or should we go to countries where potentially the experience is lower, but they have a large capacity in their apheresis centers or cell therapy centers because there are less clinical trials conducted in that area? So what we do, we really understand the capacity and appetite of our clients to go to the less explored countries or sites, or to go to the ones which are very well known, potentially closer to their manufacturing plants. And I know that your work is very critical in providing us information on those sites who are able to perform not only classical autologous or allogenic CAR-Ts, but very, very interesting and elaborated setups between different departments. And I would be interested, what are the sources you are using to find these sites who can combine very diverse departments in the scope of cell therapy?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a traditional approach to this would be that we look at disease prevalence first, and then we look at competition second. And from those data sources, from the publicly and proprietary data sources we've got, we could draw conclusions from that. But that methodology seems to break down here because, not only might we have a country where we've got a high prevalence of the disease we're looking at, but they don't have the capability, but we might find other things that are not easily visible in the data. So, for example, if we have a protocol that's got an extended hospitalization period, and some of these have got hospitalization periods as long as 10 days, you can't really see from the data, from the competitive studies, whether you can expect those sites to be able to take the trials on, because their inpatient facilities may be full due to a single trial, or they might be fully occupied because of their healthcare commitments. So actually here, the data is a good platform, but it's only a starting point. And what we've been doing over the last year is really trying to go back to having conversations with individual researchers about their interests and about their capability. And we find that that's a good way of getting ahead of the urgent tasks that we have to do when we take a study on. If we can talk about all those things, we can database and augment our data sources with this kind of human knowledge. And we're finding that's quite effective. It's time consuming, but it's rewarding and it's effective. And really, it doesn't feel like there's much substitute for those ongoing conversations with sites. It's establishing trust, and it's starting those conversations off about site selection early. And that means that we can move quickly when one of our sponsors gives us a protocol and asks us to proceed to find sites for it.
I think this is one of the strategies what we have adopted here at Fortrea to develop this relationship with our sites, isn't it? To understand their pulse, how much they can take on in terms of innovation. We really have to understand how is the construction of the healthcare system in the respective country, isn't it? So we saw that some sites, some countries, they are centralizing their clinical cell therapy approach to specific centers, while in other countries we can see that the different centers are building their own capability, and rather than centralizing the patients to these cell therapy centers. So how this is really supporting our site selection strategy, Martin?
I think it's a great question. And, the thing you highlight about national and regional differences in the delivery is important. You can look at one example, for example, you could look at Scotland, where there's a national blood transfusion service that conducts apheresis, and it provides a national infrastructure to execute some of the work that's needed for cell therapy studies. Whereas if you go to, for example, sites in the US, private sites in the US, you can find sites there that have become very adept at kind of piecing together this jigsaw of capabilities, and they might contract with one hospital that will cover the hospitalization part of the study, another facility that will conduct the apheresis, and then they'll conduct the rest of the study in their clinic. And the nub of your question, I think, is, how do you define a strategy around this? And really, there's no substitute for the expertise. And I think the expertise comes partly from the trials we've delivered. And I think we're just edging close to 100 cell therapy trials delivered now at Fortrea. And that kind of personal experience that people bring from their interactions with the investigators and their interactions with the sites. How are you managing this in the space of pre-award, of putting proposals together? Because, if you can't rely simply on the data, how are you reflecting this kind of myriad of delivery systems simply in a proposal to explain how we would deliver a trial?
Yes, that's definitely, this is the challenge when we are talking about completely new areas. There is no data behind, isn't it? We cannot say we have performed hundreds of similar trials in the same indication with the same therapeutic approach, isn't it? It's completely novel. Almost every single genetically modified cell therapy, it is novel. Although we have already a couple of cell therapies approved and marketed, the efforts of the clients to explore unknown research, research without human data, it's really making more difficult to put reliable strategies. And your effort in building this proactive site network, who is having the scientific interest to participate in such trials and leveraging this network when we make our proposal, it is very key. And there is another element which is very important when we are preparing our proposal, is really to make clear to the client that is their active participation in communication and collaboration with the key opinion leaders, with the sites. It is mandatory for the success of the trial, because the site, they really need this scientific investment what the biotech company or the sponsor has performed already in this field, and they need this very vivid interaction in order to have that scientific interest to enroll in the trial. And obviously, the data has to be convincing. We have very good results in hemato-oncology, but there is unmet need in terms of solid tumors, for example, or type of cell therapies which are providing less adverse treatment reactions. And therefore, this collaboration and these discussions between the sponsor and the site on the research data is very important. And obviously, where we are going to place these clinical trials are our very experienced early phase clinical trial sites. We actually have an early phase oncology network at Fortrea, where we have sites who have experience in cell therapies, and they are highly interested scientifically in participating in innovative treatment methods. So we are going to facilitate the collaboration and the dialogue between the sponsor and these sites in order to position these clinical trials and to start and to perform the safety research and the proof of concept.
See, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think from the investigators I've talked to, I think what's really important is their understanding of the value of the therapy under discussion to their specific patient population. The other thing you just mentioned, Andrew, is the work that we're doing to build a network of sites. And so I think you and I have been talking to, heads of CAR T units, heads of cell therapy units, individual researchers, study coordinators, national networks. That's been ongoing for, kind of 12 months plus now. And it's been a really interesting exercise. And I think what's in the back of my mind as we watch these development programs progress is that as we see they're going from phase 1 into later phases, we're aware that the small number of sites with those intensive phase 1 capabilities isn't going to be enough. We're going to need to expand to other countries and other hospitals and other places that can deliver research. So what are your thoughts on how we can help sites actually develop the expertise? What can we do as a CRO that will help them move along that kind of continuum of a relatively simple therapy to something very advanced like CAR-T?
Yes, this is the next step where we are investing significant efforts, how we can connect those sites who have actually the patient population which could benefit of the specific cell therapy, and to find those sites who are able to perform the cell therapies. So this is obviously meaningful in the countries and in the regions where the cell therapy is being centralized. It is very much depending on the capacity of the cell therapy centers, how they are able to manage their regular day-to-day treatments versus clinical trials. Some of the sites, they have large enough capacity to host both regular treatments and both clinical trials. On the other hand, some sites, they need augmentation, additional support. And I think for Tria's benefit is that we are able to support these sites with different kind of augmentations, depending on what is needed, starting from supporting the patient's travel and hosting to even to provide site augmentation in terms of management and other support.
Yeah, you see, I agree with that. And what we'd really like to do as we start bringing these sites together as a network is to create a space where sites can share that best practice. They can talk about how these issues have been solved. So the sites that are a bit earlier on in the development can benefit from that. And that's going to be essential as we go into later phases. The other thing I think we can do is to be really clever and strategic about how we place the trials. So there's a range of complexity out there. And again, if we consider the autoimmune space, we might go, for example, from assigning a site a T-cell engager trial to moving on towards an allogeneic CAR-T trial. And then finally, as they're developing experience, and we can see that they've developed the right capabilities, considering them for an autologous CAR-T trial. And that continuum of complexity is useful. And I think the benefit of an organisation like Fortrea is that we've got examples of all of those kinds of trials coming through. And we can almost go to the site and consider where they are in that development process and discuss a trial that will be right for them at the time. And then we have to consider the development of that expertise as really a long-term goal that we're engaging the sites in. And that is categorically an investment that we need to make. Otherwise, we just won't have places to place these trials.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Andrea. I think the conversation today has been really interesting. And thank you to the audience for tuning into this episode on building a realistic cell and gene therapy trial strategy. As we've heard, success in these studies depends on thoughtful planning. We do need to leverage data for site selection, and we also need to understand the operational demands of advanced therapy trials. That's just the start. when the study is complex or it's in a new indication, perhaps in something non-oncology. And in that case, we have to think a little bit out of the box and have real conversations to really understand what a site can do, what it's willing to do, and how the whole treatment fits into the country landscape. And we also need to think about how, as Fortrea, we can augment those site capacities and support the sites to be able to enable their participation as the number of trials in these kind of studies grows larger and we move into phase 3. In order to be able to do these things, you need expertise in cell therapy. And you only get that expertise by running these complex trials. And here at Fortrea, we are having these conversations with sites proactively. So we're ready to start conversations with sponsors as well. Stay with us for more episodes in this series as we continue to unpack the evolving world of cell and gene therapy. Until next time, I'm Louise Kearney, and this is Fortrea's Cell and Gene Therapy podcast series. Stay tuned and stay innovative.